Genghis Khan was dead, and all of the Mongol tribes, the allies of the Mongols, the numerous subjugated people, and the enemies of the Mongols all held their breaths to see what would happen next. Well, a new Khan happened next, a new leader and commander of the Mongolian Empire to take up where his father had left off. But this new Khan was, well, he was different. Historian René Grousset was a French historian who lived from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. He published many works in his lifetime, and his books on the Mongols, the Crusades, and medieval Central Asia are still held as some of the most definitive sources on those matters. So Grousset's opinion is kind of important in the historical world, and we'll be hearing a lot from him. But anyway, the way in which Grousset introduces this new man, this guy who would take over the Mongolian Empire after the death of Genghis Khan, well, it's just hilarious. The second Khan, the second ruler of the mighty Mongolian Empire, is introduced with these words. He had inherited none of his father's genius, passion for ruling, or energy. He was a clumsy, easygoing, jovial sot, lenient and generous in the extreme, and he took advantage of his absolute power to drink and amuse himself in his own fashion. This is the Timur Podcast. Welcome back to the Timur Podcast. My name is James, and I will be your companion as you and I investigate the character, conquests, and legacy of the infamous man, Timur the Lame. A man who arose in the mid-14th century and carved out for himself a vast empire in Central Asia. And our goal for this journey is to understand who Timur was, what did he do, why did he do it, and why does it even matter? So what happened? You said that episodes were going to release every week, and yet we had a week with no episode release. I know, but here's what happened. Things were going great. It was sunny, the birds were singing, I recorded this episode, I edited it, it was ready to launch, and then my computer destroyed it because that's just what my computer decided to do. So I re-recorded the episode, I re-edited it, and then my computer re-destroyed it. But the third try did stick the landing, so here we are with the third recording of this episode. And my laptop and I sat down and we talked about our feelings, and I think we worked out why he destroyed it in the first place, and it shouldn't happen again. But thank you for your patience and your understanding. I know that's annoying, especially for the second episode of launch, just a terrible way of doing things, but I think I solved the problem. It shouldn't happen again, so thank you for bearing with me. As you've probably noticed, I'm very new to this whole podcast production thing, and I'm sort of learning as I go, which means that I'm making a lot of mistakes. But with that said, I think I solved the problem. I hope that my computer won't lose any more recordings. And to make up for it, the plan is to either have an extra long episode next week or 2 whole episodes next week. We'll see if that happens. I'm not going to promise it, but that's what I hope to have happen. Anyway, thank you again for your patience. I really do appreciate it. And with that said, let's get back to the Mongols. If you remember from episode 1, we looked at some of the very basic ways in which Timur is often remembered today. First of all, he killed a lot of people, and the story is going to be overwhelmingly bloody, so be prepared for that. Secondly, he's often referred to as the last great nomadic conqueror, which tells us that at least part of this story is going to be centered around the nomadic way of life. And finally, that the story of Timur is tied very closely to the story of Genghis Khan. And then we traveled through the life of Genghis Khan, or Temujin as he was named when he was born, his rise to power, the creation of the Mongol Empire, and then Genghis's conquests through Mongolia, China, and Central Asia, back into China again, and then finally the death of Genghis Khan. And that is pretty much where we left off, with me saying that in the next episode, that is this episode, we would cross the gap between Genghis Khan's death and the birth of Timur. Well, that was a lie. Because turns out that covering a century or so of Mongol expansion in one episode is sort of impossible, as I should have seen coming, but I didn't. Anyway, I've split it up. This episode, we are going to look at the second Khan of the Mongolian Empire, and then next episode, we will look at really the last days of the United Mongolian Empire, And then after that, we will cover how the Mongol Empire fragmented into several different political entities. We'll look at the big four of these successor kingdoms, or khanates as they're usually called. And then this will lead eventually directly into the life of the man that supposedly this podcast is about, Timur. Because Timur is actually born directly in the heartland of one of these four successor states, or khanates. And here's the thing, Timur's early life, his birth, his childhood, rise to power, it's without a doubt the most complicated and confusing portion of his entire story. It's overwhelming. First of all, there are multiple people named Timur, so that's always fun. And then there are these alliances and political entities that are in constant motion. Some of them don't even really exist, but they still matter. Timur's family and friends are just a whole hot mess of their own. It's so confusing. But because we're taking more time on the story leading up to Timur, I think we'll really be in a good place to understand the politics of Timur's early life. So let's jump back into the history of the Mongols. And remember that this is going to be a very basic history of the Mongols, mostly because this podcast is not about them, even though it relies a ton on them, but we want to get to Timur. Nevertheless, if this does spike your interest in the Mongols, and I truly believe that everybody needs to have a Mongol history phase in their life, well, then I highly recommend the podcast series Wrath of the Khans by none other than Dan Carlin and Ben Hill's History of the Mongols. Both are excellent podcasts about the Mongolian Empire. Anyway, so Genghis Khan is dead, and his family, his client lords and leaders, his empire, and indeed much of the world is holding its breath to see what comes next. Because more often than not, when one of these amazing, charismatic, wise military men who have made incredible empires themselves, well, when they die, so often their empires die with them. When Alexander the Great died, one of the greatest conquerors of all time, a military genius who never lost a battle, when he died, his empire died with him. It disintegrated into pieces as his generals and subjects and soldiers all hectically ran around trying to grab as much land and treasure as they could. As one saying goes, Alexander's empire was gone before his corpse grew cold. When the man dies, his empire dies with him. But this didn't happen. It didn't happen at all, actually. Genghis Khan's empire passed rather smoothly on to one of his sons, and there was no great civil war or fragmentation. There are quite a few reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is that Genghis Khan's death was not unexpected, especially by Genghis Khan himself. Sure, the actual instance of his death may have been a surprise, but the guy was about 65 years old or so. He was getting to the end. Alexander the Great died when he was 32 or 33, a very young age that nobody expected, and so nobody knew what to do when he died except to grab as much power and wealth and land as they could. But Genghis expected his death, and so did his empire. He was an old man. And as you travel through Genghis's life, there's this really interesting change that you see as, well, basically he becomes more wise and thoughtful as he gets older. And you notice that he's thinking about what comes next for his empire rather than just the here and now. He's still a butcher and a conqueror and perpetrator of war crimes, as he's always been, but now there's this new side to him. In one example of this, during a campaign in China as Genghis is older, his soldiers come to him saying that they need more land to graze their horses because, as you know, nomadic armies, cavalry armies always rely on good grasslands. It's their fuel. So these troops approach their Khan and they say, "Hey Genghis, we need land, and as luck would have it, there is some perfect land here in China that we could convert. But there's this little problem." It's not really a problem. I don't even know why we're bringing it up. It's like a slight inconvenience, but on this land, there are maybe 10 million or so Chinese peasants who live there, and this is, it's an inconvenience, but can we have your permission just to kill all of them so that we can use the land for our horses? Well, younger Genghis would have almost certainly said yes to this, without so much as a second thought. This is just kind of what the Mongols do a lot of the time. They need the land for their horses, they kill everybody on the land. But older Genghis pauses and he actually consults his advisors about such an action. And one of these advisors happens to be a Chinese man himself, who no doubt felt sympathy for the 10 million of his countrymen who were balancing on a Mongolian scimitar and didn't even know it. And more importantly, this Chinese advisor knew how much the lives of these peasants would benefit the Mongol Empire should they be allowed to live. So he tells Genghis that if you let these peasants live, they will have families and sons you can use in your armies, and they'll create crops that'll feed our people, and think of all the taxes and trade that they will create if you let them live. Well, this sounds good to Genghis, and he lets the Chinese peasants live. And it's actions like this that show us that Genghis has gone from being a nomadic conqueror to the founder of an empire that is here to stay. He was now concerned with the long game. Now, the big question for this long game was who's going to take over after Genghis's death. There were 4 primary candidates. Genghis Khan had 4 sons. Well, he actually had many, many, many sons. He had countless wives and concubines. And remember, in the darker side to this history, a topic that is often left out, rape followed Genghis Khan and the Mongols wherever they went. Now, rape follows every side of every war throughout history. The Mongols were they were not unusual in this regard, but it happened, and it happened on a massive scale. And today, if you live within the borders of Genghis's empire at the time of his death, that is to say, if you are Central Asian, Mongolian, or Chinese, there's about a 10% chance that you are a direct descendant of Genghis Khan himself. But Genghis did have a favorite wife, and with this wife he had 4 sons. And he made it very clear that these 4 sons were the ones that mattered the most to him, and that is, they mattered the most to the empire. But again, the big question is, well, who is it going to be? Because if you remember from episode 1, Genghis bestows power and responsibility not on who traditions say it should be, but on who he thinks will do the best job. So let's take a look at these 4 sons, the 4 candidates for being the second Khan. The eldest son, Jochi or Joch, was the obvious choice at first glance. Jochi was your perfect Mongolian leader. He was exactly what you expected as a Mongolian warrior. He had been at his father's side through much of the early conquests, and he had proven himself as both a soldier and a commander. And because of this, the troops loved him. He was absolutely a soldier. And there was no doubt that the leader of the Mongols needed to have military experience because constant war was much of what held so many of these tribes together. A promise of treasure, slaves, and new lands has this way of keeping people loyal to you. It's kind of that old phrase, expand or die. So Jochi might actually be a good pick, but there was also a downside to picking him. First of all, he may not have been Genghis's son at all. If you remember, Genghis's wife was captured by a rival tribe, forced to marry a new man, and taken advantage of. Now, very soon after, she was rescued by Genghis, but 9 months later, she had a son, and this son was Jochi. And we really have no way of knowing whether or not this Jochi was truly Genghis's son or a bastard. Genghis always maintained that Jochi was his true son and grew furious if people questioned this. But people still questioned it. Even some of the other sons did. So you can see how this question of his true birth father might make things difficult down the road. Is Jochi the true first son of the mighty Genghis Khan? Or is he the bastard son from an act of rape from a rival tribe? That really matters to the people who are supposed to follow him. But that's not just it. There's also many more problems with picking Jochi as the heir to the Mongolian Empire. As Genghis's conquests went on, he and Jochi had this big falling out. It started as all father-son arguments do with the question of who gets to sack a particular city, and who gets the treasure and the slaves inside, the city in question being in the Khwarezmian Empire, which we talked about last week. Well, Jochi didn't get his way, so he kind of just dropped out of the conquests of his father and went and did his own thing, pouting in the distance because he didn't get his way. But more dangerously, he was also gathering together his own followers. And talk began to circle around that Jochi might be planning a civil war against his father, which, again, a big reason to not pick your son as the heir to your empire is that he might be planning to overthrow you. But the biggest reason why Genghis did not choose his eldest son Jochi to be his heir is that, well, Jochi was dead. He died a few months before Genghis did, so death, as it tends to do, eliminated Jochi from candidacy from inheriting the empire. So let's go on and look at Genghis's second son. His second son, or second favorite son, was Jagatai, or Shagatai. And again, Jagatai was your perfect Mongolian soldier. He was constantly in the ranks, among the troops, joking with them, leading them, fighting alongside them, and so preferred the life of the army that he often neglected his administrative duties. The various duties he had being the son of the great Khan. and instead he was often just hanging with his troops, his boys, raiding some village or attacking some town again. In addition, while Jochi was alive, Jagatai hated him. The two hated each other, and Jagatai was always there at the dinner table bringing up that his older brother Jochi was actually a bastard. And of course, Jochi was denying it, and so on and so forth. They hated each other. They were always at each other's throats. So even though Jochi was dead before Genghis, Genghis knew that should Jagatai be chosen, Jochi's followers and Jochi's sons might want to start a fight. They almost certainly would want to start a fight. So picking Jagatai, the second son, meant picking civil war. Finally, Jagatai was also kind of stupid. He was a good warrior and maybe militarily smart, but was pretty terrible with administrative duties. So with all that combined, he was an obvious no for Genghis. Now Genghis' third son was named Ogedei, or Ogedei, and Ogedei was exactly what we wouldn't expect as a mighty Mongolian warrior. Ogedei had fought in wars for sure, just like his brothers had, but he didn't really love the army life as his older brothers had. Ogedei loved the life of luxury, and the fine goods that came from conquered lands like Persia or China. And because of this lifestyle, Ogedei was overweight and a total alcoholic. He partied, drank, and ate, and pursued the life of luxury all the time. This is who the quote at the beginning of today's episode was about. In Grousset's words, Ogedei was a jovial sot. I mean, the most famous story about Ogedei is that he was such an alcoholic that his brothers and friends actually approached him and said, "Hey, you might want to lay off the booze for a while because this drinking it's destroying you." So after some heated conversation, I'm sure, Ogedei agreed to only drink 1 cup of wine a day, which, yeah, that's a good improvement. But of course, the measurements of this cup were never declared, so Ogedei had this gigantic basin made, filled with wine, and this was his 1 daily cup of wine that he agreed to. But, on the other hand to all of this, Ogedei got along with the other brothers at least reasonably well, and he was sort of a genius. He knew how to play politics. He knew how administrative codes worked and how taxation should be implemented. He knew the importance of infrastructure and maintaining the army, and people respected him because of this. So as long as Ogedei was kept at least somewhat sober, he'd actually be a pretty good candidate to rule. Finally, the fourth and youngest son, Tolaui, he was kind of considered too young and inexperienced to be the candidate. He was given the title, a very important title actually, of the Guardian of the Hearth, which basically meant that his job was to protect the homeland, and again, very prestigious position, but not really a candidate for becoming the next Khan. And like Genghis' son Jagatai, Tolaui wasn't very smart, at least when it came to things like administration, and like Genghis' son Ogedei, Tolaui was also a raging alcoholic. So those are your choices, Genghis. You have a possible bastard son who nobody likes and is also dead, a soldier son who will cause civil war and is also not too bright, an obese alcoholic son who is smart, sure, but he's not really a true warrior, and the youngest son who is a drunk. Now, as you probably know or have guessed, Genghis chose his third son, Ogedei, the drunk fat guy, to inherit his empire. And this turned out to be a brilliant decision, as Ogedei would become one of the greatest Khans of the Mongol Empire ever, really. And so Genghis Khan dies in 1227, and the youngest son Tolaui rules for the next 2 years or so, as was customary, him being the protector of the hearth, the protector of kind of the realm. And these 2 years gave enough time for all the Mongolian leaders to gather at what's called a Kurultai, or an assembly. And at this assembly, Ogedei is elected. He's elected as the new Khan of the Mongol Empire. Now, I say elected, but everybody knew at this point that Ogedei was the one whom Genghis chose, and nobody really complained about this. You wouldn't, because this is Genghis Khan's choice, and without Genghis Khan, none of this would exist, so we need to respect what the Khan says. Now, Jochi, the eldest brother of Genghis Khan, he was dead, but his family accepted Ogedei's leadership because they're just happy that it wasn't the son Jagatai, and Jagatai accepted Ogedei because at least it wasn't Jochi's family, and, well, he'd much rather be with the soldiers anyway. And the youngest son, Tolaui, accepted Ogedei because, well, he was basically happy with where he was in life, and also Tolaui and Ogedei had a relationship more like what you would expect between brothers, much less openly hostile. So Ogedei was named Khan, the second Khan of the Mongolian Empire, and he would rule for 12 years, from 1229 through 1241. And in my opinion, Ogedei is one of the more underrated Khans of Mongol history. Everybody knows Genghis Khan, everybody probably has heard of Kublai Khan, but rarely do you ever hear Ogedei. And Ogedei really deserves more because what he manages to do in 12 years as Khan is really incredible. So let's talk about that. First of all, he really built up the infrastructure of the Mongolian Empire. As his father and his advisors instructed him, the empire had been won from the saddle, but it could not be ruled from a saddle. Thus, Ogodei established a capital city for the Mongol Empire, the city of Karakorum. The city of Karakorum is today situated in modern-day Mongolia, and the area around it had often been the site of other previous nomadic kingdoms, and it was also in the heartland of Mongolia, so it was really the perfect place to build a capital. And so Ogedei did. He organized the building of roads, markets, and walls for the new city, and the city quickly became one of the most important cities in the world, right up there with Beijing, Baghdad, Damascus, Constantinople, Rome, all those other cities. Well, Karakorum is now up there as well. Ogedei also worked out the details of a complicated tax code for the conquered provinces. Districts were made, censuses were taken, and every region was taxed based on the various goods it created and the population it housed. So, for example, the portion of China that had been conquered by the Mongols was broken into 10 districts, and each district had a certain amount of silk and silver and grain that they had to give to the Mongolian government every year based off what they could produce. Further, the Mongolian code of law, usually called the Yasa, was implemented empire-wide, and many of its details were really finalized, all this adds to the stability of the empire at large. So, for example, according to this code of laws, and this is one of the most famous things about the Mongolian Empire, is that for the time, the Mongols were very religiously tolerant. There were Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians, and all sorts of pagans within the empire, and the Mongols were generally pretty cool with whatever faith you had, as long as you didn't cause problems. But still, this is a lot better than other places around the world at the same time, where it doesn't matter if you're causing problems or not. If you're not of the right faith, you gotta go. So because of new plans and decisions like these, the empire really became stable under Ogedei's reign. But in addition to these important administrative changes, as any good Mongol Khan does, Ogedei went to war. And he went to war everywhere, and soon proved himself to be a warrior and conqueror worthy of the title of Khan. The first peoples to feel the wrath of Ogedei were the Jin dynasty, also called the Jurchens, or sometimes you'll see the Qin dynasty in northern China. And you'll remember them from last week. These are the people that Genghis had invaded. And yeah, the war's still going on, because these wars in China have this tendency to go on for decades. So Ogedei invades, leading a massive invasion of the Jurchen land. And the Mongol horsemen, they swarm in. And if the Chinese retreat into defensive forts or mountains, as they often did, no matter, because the Mongols, they went on, encircling the troops they did find on the open plains and pillaging whatever farmland or villages they came across. So what you ended up with here is that you had these fortified cities and mountain fortresses that were holding out. The Jurchen had retreated to these places, and the Mongols were unable or just didn't really care about storming them right now. But these fortresses and cities are like little islands surrounded by the Mongols and completely cut off from one another. Then, to make things worse for the Jurchen, their old traditional enemy, the Sung dynasty of China, down in the south, they joined the Mongols in invading. The remaining Jurchen were now smashed in a sandwich of doom. The Mongols were pressing in through the north and the west, and the Sung were invading from the south. Also, the Sung gave valuable infantry battalions to the Mongols in order to storm and crush the last cities and fortresses of the Jurchen. Because remember, the Mongols, they're a horse people. They don't really feel comfortable fighting on foot. But now that they have Chinese troops, they can finally destroy these cities. Anyway, by 1234, the Jurchen or the Jin or the Qin realm in China, however you want to say it, it was gone. And this was big for Ogedei. In fact, according to the Secret History of the Mongols, which is one of the most definitive primary sources on the early life of the Mongol Empire, and also one of the coolest named sources, well, it says that as Ogedei lay on his deathbed, he proclaimed that the destruction of the Jurchen was the number one thing he was most proud of. It was the task that his father had left to him, and the task that he had dutifully completed. Now, back to China. Because the Sung dynasty had come to the aid of the Mongols, Ogedei was quick to reward their allegiance and let them keep many of the formerly Jurchen territories. Again, if you help the Mongols, they will most likely help you. But for one reason or another, this wasn't enough for the Sung government. They wanted more. So in yet another tragic grand mistake in history, the Sung sent some men to occupy some villages in Mongol territory. They were repulsed pretty easily, but now the Mongols knew how the Sung truly felt. Again, for those of you new to Mongol history, last week we covered rule number 1 when dealing with the Mongols, and that is, don't kill Mongolian diplomats. Well, rule number 2 of dealing with the Mongols is don't betray them. Because sure enough, Ogedei is enraged, and at the Kurultai of that year, or the Mongol assembly that is, of 1235, Ogedei announces that this means war with the Sung dynasty. And so the Mongols do what the Mongols do best, and they invade. Now, a quick side note here. Last week I mentioned that the Mongols and other steppe people are often referred to as hordes. Those barbarian hordes from the steppe. Well, this isn't accurate. During the medieval era, the armies that were gathered in Europe and the Middle East, they looked more like the hordes than the Mongol army did. In those places, the rich aristocracy and professional troops who could afford horses and armor, well, they were the main punching force, if you will. But most of the troops in these European and Middle Eastern armies, well, they were peasants or militia soldiers, basically people with very little training or equipment and also no desire to be here, most of the time threatened to be in your army, but they're not going to fight well. But the idea behind this is that the enemy will attack your worthless peasant meat shields, while your actual soldiers, your aristocracy, and your lords and your kings can sweep around, flank the enemy, and crush them there. Anyway, there are of course exceptions to this, but overall, this is how many armies functioned in medieval Europe and the medieval Middle East. But the Mongol army is way more organized than this. First of all, the Mongol soldiers used the decimal system of organization, which, by the way, most militaries still use today. 10 men are the smallest unit, then 10 units of 10 men were the next unit, then 10 units of 10 units of 10 men were the next unit, and so on and so forth. The army is not divided by class, but by number. And that is going to do wonders for the cohesion of your soldiers. Also, if we go back to this invasion of the Sung dynasty happening right now under Ogedei, the Mongols, they're not swarming in like locusts. No, they are advancing in a 3-pronged attack like a trident, and each prong is going to surround and cut off the enemy. They'll have supply lines and reinforcements that stretch all the way back to Mongolia. Each unit and army has very specific tasks. This is not a horde. This is an invading force that is so advanced in their tactics and strategy that nobody in the world can match it. 8 centuries later, when German tank divisions in the Second World War are going to be slicing their way through Russia, guess what those tank commanders are reading? Yeah, they're reading about Mongolian tactics, the tactics of quickly and efficiently using cavalry or tanks to cut through your enemy. And if you come across a heavily defended position, just ignore it and keep going. The infantry can clean that up, or we'll just starve them out because now they're surrounded. Again, all this to say that the Mongols were not a horde. And militarily speaking, they were leaps and bounds ahead of everybody at this time and place. Anyway, so the Mongol hordes, as people still love to call them, they invade the Sung dynasty in China. And what happens next is this little old war that lasts 4.5 decades between the Sung and the Mongols, so that's a lot of fun. Meanwhile, though, at the same time, Ogedei also sends an army into Korea to subjugate the Koreans. Now, the Koreans had been subjugated before, sort of. I mean, their capital of Kaesong was actually policed by Mongolian soldiers. But then the Koreans broke rule number 3 of dealing with the Mongols, and that is, never ever slaughter a whole bunch of Mongol soldiers who are occupying your capital. But they do. And of course, Ogedei is enraged. And so the Mongols invade Korea, and by the year 1236, the Korean peninsula was back under Mongol domination. Now, something that sets Ogedei apart from his father Genghis is that Genghis was very, very careful to always follow one of those rules of war. Well, we all know this rule, and that is only ever fight on one front. Because as soon as you're fighting on 2 fronts or multiple fronts, well, your soldiers and your supplies and your support, they're divided. And with this, your odds of winning the war go down significantly. Well, Ogedei doesn't follow this rule because Ogedei does what Ogedei wants to do. And if Ogedei wants to open several fronts up and invade everywhere at the same time, then guess what Ogedei is going to do? Yeah, exactly. So while these wars in Korea and China are raging on, let's head back on over to the west. If you'll remember from last episode, the mighty Islamic Khwarezmian Empire had fallen to Genghis Khan, and its people, a lot of its people, lay murdered and its cities sacked. Well, while the Khwarezmian Empire was now gone, many of the people of Persia, Central Asia, and Afghanistan still remembered their glory days under the Khwarezmian banner. And in addition, although the Khwarezmian Shah had been killed by the Mongols, his son and rightful heir to the throne was still on the loose. This was a man by the name of Jalal al-Din, and his story is so interesting that I have to at least mention it at this point. So Jalal's father had lost to the Mongols, and he lost his life as well, and the empire was destroyed, but Jalal wanted the empire back. And with the help from the Islamic Sultanate in India and some Turkic principalities formerly in the Khwarezmian Empire, Jalal managed to build an army, and in name at least, re-establish the Khwarezmian Empire in the western regions it had once held, that is, in kind of western Persia. And because the Mongols were busy elsewhere at this time, electing a new Khan and engaged in China and Korea and places like this, Jalal picked the perfect time to rebel and to reclaim his father's glory. His plan actually worked. Within just a few years, Jalal held territory in western Persia and Azerbaijan. He defeated the Christian Georgians in the Caucasus, and he was sitting on a pretty comfortable empire. But Jalal knows what you and I both know as well. The Mongols are coming back. You don't just take some of their land and then live happily ever after. And at this point, and I don't know why he did this, but Jalal breaks rule number 4 when dealing with the Mongols. Instead of allying with everybody who are not Mongols to form a grand alliance to fight the Mongols, Jalal decides to fight everybody who are not Mongols before he then goes to fight the Mongols. And so Jalal attacks everybody who they were obvious choices for allies against the inevitable Mongol return. Most of the other powerhouses of the day in that area, well, they were Islamic like Jalal, and they were very worried themselves about a return of the Mongols. But regardless, Jalal attacks them. He attacks the Ayyubid Muslims in Damascus, he attacks the Caliphate in Baghdad, and he attacks the Konya Sultanate in Eastern Asia Minor. Again, these were powerful fellow Islamic kingdoms that would have probably been eager to join with Jalal to fight against the Mongols. But Jalal messed it all up. So he attacks these different people, and eventually his army is absolutely crushed. Jalal does escape, but guess what? Now the Mongols are here! 30,000 of them, and they're pillaging and slaughtering their way through your empire, and you, Jalal, have no army to defend your lands against them. Well, Jalal manages to escape the Mongols for quite a bit of time, and it's kind of this exciting game of cat and mouse until finally Jalal gets killed by a peasant, and thus ends the final legacy of the Khwarezmian Empire. But now, because of this whole little adventure, the Mongols have a firm presence in the Middle East, and, well, they kind of like what they see. There's no strong powerhouse here. There's kind of actually a power vacuum now that Jalal is gone. There are plenty of good grasslands and cities ripe for the taking. So the Mongols do what the Mongols do best, and they just keep on invading. The Christian kingdom of Georgia in the Caucasus is defeated and subjugated, and actually Georgian soldiers are forced to join the Mongol ranks. The Turkic Sultanate of Konya in Eastern Asia Minor, who had just defeated Jalal a few years prior, well, they are utterly crushed by the Mongols and forced to become a client state. Further, the Christian kingdom of the Armenians, which was not in present-day Armenia, but was actually in Cilicia, which is in the southeastern corner of Asia Minor, well, they wisely submit to the Mongols. And also the Muslim kingdom centered around the fortress city of Mosul in modern-day Iraq, well, they also submit. And what does all this mean? Well, it's 1244, and the Mongols now have a very firm presence in the Middle East. They've subjugated many of the powerhouses, and now they border Egypt, they border the Caliphate of Baghdad, they border the Byzantine or the Roman Empire, and they border Europe. Most of this happened during Ogedei's reign, and while you can kind of see what's coming on later down the road, there are going to be some pretty gigantic conflicts in the Middle East. Now, the last thing we have to cover in regards to Ogedei is the Mongol invasion of Russia and Europe, which, again, it's happening at the same time as the wars in Persia and the Caucasus and China and Korea. The Mongols don't care. They have the manpower and the infrastructure and the leadership to pull this insanity off. So, the Mongol invasion of Russia begins in 1236 or 1237, depending on the source, and the Mongols invade with 150,000 men or so. Now, the Mongols had kind of been in the region a little bit before. When Genghis Khan was invading the Khwarezmian Empire years earlier, he had sent a grand raiding party through the Caucasus and into southern Russia, around the Caspian Sea to pillage and plunder, and most importantly, to scout. There were some battles between this raiding party and the people living in today's what is the southern Russian steppe, but now the real legacy of that grand raiding party was, well, the Mongols are back, and they want to totally defeat and subjugate the peoples they had encountered on that raid years earlier. So now, under Ogedei's direction, 150,000 Mongols are invading Russia. And the first people they come across are known as the Volga Bulgars, an Islamic Turkic kingdom on the northern edge of the Caspian Sea and around the Volga River, giving to their name. Well, surprise, surprise, the Mongols win, and the Volga Bulgars are no more. What this means, though, is now Mongol territory borders the lands of the Kipchaks, or the Cumans. You'll see different ways. The Middle Eastern sources call these people the Kipchaks, and European sources often call them the Cumans. So you will hear Kipchak or the Kipchak Confederacy or Cuman or Cuman. It all refers to the same people. Now, the Kipchaks, or Cumans, were a loose confederacy of nomadic people much like the Mongols. They were primarily pagan, but some of them were definitely Christian or Muslim. And they inhabited the area that is today the Ukraine and southern Russia. And although the Kipchaks were nomadic and similar to culture to the Mongols, the two people did not get along. First of all, the Kipchaks had fought alongside the Volga Bulgars against the Mongols on more than one occasion. Also, the Mongols had demanded that the Kipchaks submit to and join the Mongols, as so many of the other nomadic steppe tribes had, but the Kipchaks responded with, "Hey, screw you." So Ogedei and the Mongols in charge of the invasion wanted the Kipchaks gone, and so the Mongols invade. And long story short, by the year 1238 or so, most of the Kipchak people were subjugated or killed, and their land was taken. However, some of them did escape. Maybe as many as 40,000 of them did escape. And again, this was a grand confederacy of numerous tribes, and so many of these tribes fled in the only direction left to them, west, which now meant that tens of thousands of these pagan nomads were going to bump right into settled Christian Europe. And we'll get back to them in a few minutes, but let's head back to Russia and the Mongols for the time being. Now, I say Russia, but there is no united concept of what we would today call Russia back then. I'm really only referring to the geography of the region we now call Russia and the people who live there. Because living in what is now Russia were really kind of two types of people. We already talked about the Cumans, or the Kipchaks, who were usually nomadic, usually pagan people. But there was also this other category of people living in Russia, the people called the Rus. Now, the story of the Rus, who they were, it's very complicated and confusing and is very often blended with legend, but the gist of it is that Scandinavians, usually from Sweden, pillaged and traveled their way through Russia basically as Vikings. So while Norwegian and Danish Vikings were terrorizing Western Europe, places like England and Ireland and France, places like that, well, Swedish Vikings were making their way east into Russia and Eastern Europe. And as Vikings often do, they eventually settled down. And if you want a very simple summary of Viking history, the Viking Golden Age, that is, well, that's about 200 years or so. And for the first 100 years, Vikings tend to pillage and to steal and to kill and enslave. And then for the next 100 years, they often settle and colonize the lands they once pillaged. That is a very, very rough summary of Viking history, but what this means for Russia is that in the end of the first millennia, Swedish Vikings and adventurers and traders and mercenaries, well, they begin settling along the many rivers in the Ukraine and Russia. And eventually, these Scandinavians intermarry with the native Slavic peoples to the point where this new type of people, the majority Slavic, the minority Scandinavian, well, they're eventually given the title of Rus. Which, of course, eventually turns into the Rus, the Russians, Russia. Anyway, unlike their nomadic neighbors, the Kipchaks or Cumans, whatever you want to say, the Rus are a settled people. They live in cities scattered throughout Russia, and usually they're mostly Orthodox Christian instead of pagan. And so these two very different peoples are neighbors in Russia, or what we would call Russia. You have these settled Christian cities scattered throughout a sea of nomadic pagans. And the relationship between these two groups of people is complicated at best. Again, the nomadic peoples are only very loosely united, and the Rus cities are really their own kind of city-states, much like the city-states of, say, Sparta or Athens and otherwise in ancient Greece. But the point of all this is that this is a divided land. Nobody's really united into a grand empire. There is no empire. You have different city-states and then different tribal people. But what this really means for us is that this is a perfect place for a powerful invader to come sweeping through. And speaking of this, something I found interesting is that the political climate of what is Russia at this point in time is sort of identical to the climate of what would later be called Uzbekistan on the eve of Timur coming to power 150 years later. And just because we're all dying to get to Timur, let's get ahead of ourselves for just a few minutes and talk about the political climate on the eve of Timur. Now, during Timur's early childhood, the land around him in Central Asia can kind of, again, be divided into these two groups of people that we've mentioned so many times at this point. You have the settled people and the nomadic people. There are, of course, exceptions to these two groups of people and people who are kind of within these two groups or outside of both these two groups, but for the sake of simplicity, these are the two main groups in Central Asia at the time of Timur. You have the nomadic people and the settled people. And in Timur's case, the nomadic people around him were often pagan or either pagan or new converts to Islam. They were nomadic and tribal. They were the descendants of the Mongols themselves or from other nomadic tribes who had settled here after the Mongol conquests. And they weren't really united except for, a very loose confederacy. The second group of people that would have been around with Timur's childhood and his early life were the settled peoples who lived in, again, basically kind of city-states. These people were almost always Islamic, were indigenous to the land. They relied on trade and farming for their livelihood. So going back in time to Russia with the Mongols, you have those two divisions of people, the settled monotheist city-states and then the scattered nomadic polytheists. Both groups are often fighting amongst themselves, but are also often coexisting in this very strange but sort of beautiful coalition of vastly different cultures in the same land. Anyway, that's really all I'm going to say about this at this point in time. But again, the story of the Mongols and the story of Timur just have all of these thousands of ways in which they overlap and correlate. But getting back to the Mongolian invasion of Russia. So most of the Kipchaks, those nomadic pagan people, they're being defeated and driven out by the Mongols. So, now these settled Rus people, these city-states, what do? Do they stand with their pagan neighbors who have often been their enemies, but hey, we might need to in order to survive against this new wave of enemies? Do we submit to these Mongols? Do we do both? Neither? Who knows? Because again, these cities are not united in any way or form. They all have their own goals and their petty rivalries that have lasted hundreds of years. And oftentimes they would kind of play the Mongols against their old rivalries, which is so petty, but whatever, that's how humans work. But one thing is certain, regardless of where all these Rus city-states stood, none of them were prepared for the overwhelming nightmare that is the Mongol invasion. There was this mystery, this sort of fear that overran Russia before the Mongol horsemen even arrived. There's this one primary source called the Novgorodian Chronicle, and it's one of the few sources we do have on this time period that, it introduces the Mongols to the narrative with just kind of this terrifying line. It introduces the Mongols with, in that same year, that is 1224, for our sins there came unknown tribes, and no one knew who they were or what was their origin, faith, or tongue. So the Rus don't even know who or what they're dealing with. And before they can figure things out, who do we ally with? Do we help each other? Do we fight on the side of the Kipchaks? What are we going to do? It's too late. The Mongols are here. And so begins this brutal cycle of Mongol subjugation. The Mongols arrive outside the walls of these cities demanding surrender and subjugation. The cities almost always refuse, choosing death to slavery. And so the Mongols utterly leveled the cities. And important cities like Ryazan, Suzdal, Vladimir, Kiev, Moscow, and a few dozen more all fell and were destroyed by the Mongols. A few cities did choose subjugation to death, but most of these Rus city-states all across Russia disappeared from the face of the earth. And by the year 1240, the Russian principalities of Russia were gone, the nomadic tribes were killed or subjugated, and Mongolian banners covered the entire Russian steppe, or, well, most of the entire Russian steppe. Now, if you can't tell, I find the Mongolian invasion of Russia just utterly fascinating and terrifying. It is this just incredible story that is so often neglected in the grand scheme of history. I never heard about it until I was like 22 or something. However, there are people out there who really do a great job diving into this invasion in case you want to hear more about it. So the show I've been listening to a lot recently is the Russian History Podcast, and Gareth is the host, and he does a great job. And recently he has covered in depth the Mongol invasions of Russia. And also, if you want a sneak peek at Timur, his podcast also talks about Timur's invasions of Russia, which is a bit of a spoiler, but there you go, just in case you can't wait. Anyway, it's a great podcast, and Russian history often gets the short end of the stick, so it's really neat to just hear a podcast that really focuses on Russian history. Anyway, back to the Mongols, which really could and maybe should be the name of this podcast. Instead of the outrageously creatively named The Timur Podcast, I should have just gone with Anyway, Back to the Mongols. Anyway, back to the Mongols, they have conquered all of Russia. But there's this problem for them, and that is that 40,000 families or individuals of those Kipchaks, those nomadic pagan people who lived in Russia, well, they've escaped to Christian Europe. And the Mongols want to finish them off, or at least subjugate them. So heading back to the Kipchaks, well, these 40,000 or so who escaped, they are under the leadership of a chief named Chief Kutan. And he leads them to the Christian kingdom of Hungary, where they beg for safety against the Mongols. And now the Hungarians have also heard these stories about the Mongols, so hey, this might actually be a good deal. And so the Hungarian king, after talking with his advisors and whatnot, approaches the Kipchak chief and says, here's the deal, if you baptize yourself and if you fight alongside us when the Mongols do come, you can stay here and we'll do our best to protect you. So finally, there is some sort of alliance system actually being put in place to stand up against the Mongols. Further, and here's another point, the Kingdom of Poland, they also want in, because they too are now bordering the Mongols. And everybody is just terrified of the Mongols they're coming. Of course the Mongols are coming. The Mongols are always coming. So Poland's in, the Kipchaks are in, Hungary is in, and then the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, they also want to join this defensive party. So finally, again, we have these powers, these small kingdoms and peoples, putting aside their differences to form a defensive pact against the Mongols. Unfortunately for them, things go badly for this European alliance pretty much right away. So the Kipchak people, the nomads in Hungary, they sort of begin stealing from and raiding their Hungarian hosts. That's part of their livelihood, is raiding. And the Hungarians, knowing that these Kipchaks are basically refugees, well, they begin extorting them and taking advantage of them. So already you can see these problems, this mistrust just growing between the Hungarians and the Kipchaks. And very soon this mistrust, it overflows and it turns into fights and brawls. And before you know it, the Kipchaks and the Hungarians are fighting each other. The Hungarian king and the Kipchak chieftain, they try to quell this and again to reform that alliance, but it's too late. They're unable to. And the Hungarians they're forced to put down this Kipchak rebellion. Now, after some fighting, the Hungarians do manage to quell this Kipchak rebellion, at least most of it, enough of it. But here's the problem. Now, not only have they lost an ally, but they've had to spend valuable resources and manpower destroying that ally. And guess what? Yeah, the Mongols are already here. They're sweeping through your land, destroying your outer posts and cities, and you don't have any time to reorganize. But hey, at least we had other allies. Maybe the Polish army will come to our aid, and then a Polish-Hungarian allied force can finally repulse the Mongols. Well, unfortunately, we'll never know if the Polish people would have done this because the Mongols knew about this danger of a united force. So the Mongols, divided their army and attacked Poland and Hungary simultaneously. And in one of those weird historical facts, the two big battles of these separate invasions happened within 2 days of one another. On April 9th, 1241, the Mongols annihilated the Polish forces at the Battle of Legnica, and 2 days later, on April 11th, the Mongols crushed the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohi. All of Eastern Europe was now wide open for Mongolian devastation, and they did go on devastating and burning, pillaging, raping, enslaving, and slaughtering their ways through Poland, Hungary, Croatia, Austria, Bulgaria, and more. Eventually, kind of the last member of that alliance, the Holy Roman Empire, they managed to gather an army of Germans and Crusaders, and they tried to stop the Mongols, and they too were crushed. And seemingly there was nothing Europe could do to stop the Mongols. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, the entire invasion ground to a halt, and the Mongolian armies began to leave Europe and travel back to the Eurasian steppe. Now, this is sort of a mystery, and there are a lot of different theories on why this happened, because no doubt the Mongols could have continued to win, maybe even all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. There are a few historians who argue that. But for some reason, the Mongols stopped their advancing and began to systematically retreat. Now, this may be because of their realization that they overextended. Maybe it was because that year there was a particularly bad winter. Or maybe, and perhaps most likely, the Mongols withdrew because their Khan, Ogedei Khan, had died. Because of his excessive binge drinking, the Khan, Ogedei, was now dead. And the vast Mongolian Empire found itself back at that pivotal question, what happens next? So maybe the Mongols in all these different corners of the world were marching back to Mongolia to submit to the next Khan, or maybe some of them were marching back so that they could, maybe grab a bigger slice of the leadership roles within the Mongolian Empire. So we'll probably never know the definitive reason why the Mongolian invasion of Europe ground to a halt. There are so many different theories out there. But it did halt, and the Mongolians were, retreating is the wrong word, but they were moving back to kind of the heartland of the empire. As for Ogedei, though, he was dead, and he's typically remembered as one of the greater Khans of the Mongol Empire. In the secret history of the Mongols, Ogedei himself proclaims that he did 4 things for the Mongol people and the empire. Number 1, like we said earlier, he was very proud that he had finished his father's subjugation of the Jurchen people in China. Number 2, he was proud that he created a messenger system throughout the entire empire that allowed riders to quickly pass information anywhere throughout the empire. Number 3, he built wells all throughout the empire and brought better reserves of water to his people, which again is very important when a lot of your land is arid desert. And number 4, he stationed troops in all of the important cities and made sure that the borders were secure. And all of these things are certainly true and gigantic accomplishments, but also remember that Ogedei created the city of Karakorum, so now the Mongols had an actual capital, and Ogedei had maybe not directly led, but had directed and supported and supplied the Mongolian invasions of the Caucasus, Western Persia, of the Sung dynasty, in China, of Korea, most of Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. He proved to be just as able a commander and conqueror as his father. Through Ogedei's reign, the Mongol Empire had gone from being a nomadic empire on the steppe and lands touching the steppe to being a global empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. But now he was dead, and again the world held its breath to see what was going to happen next. So that about wraps it up for the second episode of the Timur podcast. Next week we'll take a look at a few Khans and also a few queens who write the next few chapters of Mongolian history. After that, we'll get to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, and we'll look at why that happened and what that means, and then we will look at the 4 big fragmented pieces of the empire and see what happens to each of them. And that will lead us directly into the life and birth of Timur. Again, thank you for listening to the show. We should be back on schedule now for a new episode every week. If you want to reach out to me, find the show notes, or find out other places to listen to the Timur podcast, then check out the podcast website at timurpodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Podcast Timur or on Facebook at TimurPod. I will be posting different maps, additional information, and, the new episodes on those social media sites, so that's a good way of staying in the loop. Finally, with the way we're moving now, I think we should get to Timur by the end of this month, or at the very latest by the end of the year. And we will continue that next week with the beginning of the end of the United Mongolian Empire right here on the Timur Podcast.